It's getting cold outside, but what rabbits undergo to make your Angora sweater should make you think twice. Exposing the cruelty of Angora products. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, your soft Angora garment, the cruelty to rabbits, a fashion don't. A PETA veterinarian takes fashion execs to see how their products are sourced in China.
We went in there and we saw animals who were literally debilitated by infections of their eyes and their ears. It was incredibly hot inside a lot of these warehouses, not to mention the stench, but incredibly hot. So a lot of these rabbits who are temperature sensitive, rabbits are known for being very temperature sensitive animals, were just laying there, just huffing and puffing, just unable to really move. And so hot, just salivating nonstop. And so they would get these infections under their mouths because there was so much saliva that they were producing in the heat. And they would get these skin infections and eye infections. And a lot of those, especially the ear infections, are highly contagious. So we saw a lot of this. It was rampant. There's just not any control of the disease going on in these situations.
When fashion execs thought their Angora products were just fine, Heather Rowley, a veterinarian with PETA, brought them to China to see how the Angora rabbits were treated. It was jaw-dropping. The company, which we can't name, soon dropped Angora. Others should also, if they could only see. But the trip to the rabbit farms in China took a personal toll on the PETA veterinarian, Heather Rowley.
Oh, it was horrible. It was a really hard experience personally. This was the first time I've ever really been in a situation like that. As a veterinarian, obviously, I'd spent years of my life training specifically to be able to intervene in suffering of this kind. And I was just physically unable to do absolutely anything to help them. And it was horrible. And I had to walk away from every one of those animals, hundreds of animals over the course of these few days for touring these farms who I was unable to help.
Rowley is one of the subjects of the new PETA Reveals series on PETA.org. You'll want to check out the video after you hear her talk about her journey to China on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. You know, it's important. Diseases shouldn't go viral, but podcasts should. Let your friends know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you're new to the podcast, by all means, be a binger. Be a fierce binger. Meet PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk in episode 1. She talks about animal rights and about an issue you need to understand. No-kill shelters, good or bad. Hear it from Ingrid herself. And hear Ingrid's words on why mothers on the southern border should have never been separated from their children. That's on episode 24. A cow is a child, is an immigrant. Issue has been forgotten, but and a record number of children remain separated, but hear how PETA has helped. Wondering what PETA is doing to stop vivisection? Is that some new department at the school library? No, it's animal experimentation. Check it out. Episodes 11, 9, and 20 will help you get a big picture view about the fight against vivisection. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Heather Rowley is a PETA veterinarian and featured in the new video series PETA Reveals on PETA.org. On this podcast, she talks about her evolution as an activist, how her connection to animals began as a young girl, and how she continues to fight for the animals working for PETA. But it was that trip to China to help fashion execs see the cruelty to Angora rabbits that she soon won't forget. Here's my conversation with PETA veterinarian Heather Rowley on the PETA Podcast. Heather, thank you very much for being part of the PETA Podcast.
My pleasure.
I checked out the PETA Reveals, and the idea is that people will hear us talk about PETA Reveals and will be so compelled to, by the conversation we have, that they'll go to PETA Reveals at PETA.org and say, oh, that's what she's talking about. So we're going to get to that. But, the podcast talks about people at PETA and talks about what motivates them and what keeps them going. And so you're a veterinarian. How long have you been a veterinarian, and why did you become a vet of all things? You could have been anything in the world.
Indeed. Why a vet? So, I have always wanted to be a veterinarian. My mother will tell you I popped out that way. So I always knew at least that I would work with animals. And I think my family, seeing that passion in me at a very young age, they fostered me in what they felt was sort of the best professional direction, which was, of course, towards veterinary medicine. So, I fell in love with vet med very early in life. Those Animal Planet shows, watching vets do surgeries and all sorts of crazy things. And I was just fascinated. I loved it. And I've always wanted to just care for animals.
Did you have a lot of companion animals growing up too? And
I did. Yes, they were very tolerant of vet bills. My parents were. And actually, so now I do work primarily with wildlife campaigns for PETA. And my passion has always really been in wildlife work. And so I became known quite early on in my childhood as the local wildlife rehabber. And so once you have a reputation for that, you never know what's going to show up on your doorstep. And my parents were very, very, very tolerant. We would always take them to the vet. And if it was appropriate, they would, teach me how to care for them. And then we would eventually take them to rehabilitation and release sites so they could be returned to the wild.
You're talking about injured birds, or maybe
primarily injured birds.
Maybe a raccoon or a small mammal or something?
Yeah, when it came to small mammals, we would always send them to rehabbers. And of course, you're supposed to send them to rehabbers because there are people, even for the birds, who do this professionally and are very competent. It was a bit of a different time when I was a kid. And so there were, definitely the occasional, mostly doves that I would raise. And so I became pretty passionate about wildlife, some, reptiles as well, lizards and snakes and things. But I was always really into reptiles, really into birds, really into wildlife in general.
It must have been strange because if you grew up in Los Angeles, Los Angeles isn't exactly, a wildlife kingdom.
Right.
But I guess there is there are the animals were displaced by the urbanness of LA. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually. Even more so, I think in some ways, animals need help, with human wildlife conflict that happens in cities. They're struggling to survive amidst the urban jungle. And so, a car being hit by a car, or, for birds, windows are a really big problem. They don't see them. And so that's a big cause of death for wild birds, cats, and other things that the human population brings with it. So lots of challenges to wildlife.
So you grew up animal loving, and you're on the vet med track. You're a kid and you get to veterinary school, and it must have shocked you somewhat to find that just because your people are vets or into vet med, they're not necessarily animal rights type people. That must have shocked you a little bit, huh?
Yeah, I definitely went into veterinary school with a sort of different career goal than most veterinarians, just wanting to do wildlife alone. Most vets go in to do cat and dog clinical medicine. And so I always knew I wanted to do wildlife. And at the time, I had already been involved in activism and just felt really compelled to do something bigger than just, treating animals and giving vaccines and prescribing flea medications in clinic. So, I always really wanted to do something in more of an advocacy role, and finding that through my veterinary career, not only that there weren't a lot of vet students who were interested in the advocacy path or knew anything about it, but that the work that we were asked to do, whether it was through rotations on dairy farms or through university laboratories, it was all really shocking to see how entrenched the veterinary industry was in what I felt were, complacent, in basically animal abuse and neglect type industries. And it was hard to have to go through that. I'm really grateful that I did, because it gave me a perspective to be able to, I feel, really formulate opinions and really go after those industries, which is a lot of what I do with PETA now. But yeah, it was eye-opening for sure.
Early on in our conversation, you said that, you were born this way. I guess that's Lady Gaga's line, right? But what is it about activism when you're torn, or you're directed, self-directed in a way? Is it really kind of like is it a God-given thing, or was there something that happened that made you kind of like snap and say, "Oh, I've got to do this for the animals"? But can you identify that sort of moment in your life?
Yeah, actually I can. So I say I was born this way in the sense that I was definitely born with a passion and deep, deep love for animals, but I definitely wasn't born an activist. I've sort of evolved into an activist, and my awakening really kind of came later in life, actually around sort of the time I was entering veterinary school. And it was primarily credited to a film called The Cove, which is about the dolphin slaughter in Japan. And this film came out right before I entered veterinary school. And I had already been doing at this stage several years of marine mammal rescue and rehabilitation work along the coast of California. And that was and remains my deepest passion. And I, was going to veterinary school to do this work and considered myself a member of the marine mammal scientific community for what it's worth. And then I saw this film, and in 90 minutes, it was not only devastating, it was just to learn about the actual issues themselves. The issues were devastating, but I was really disappointed in myself, because I realized that I knew nothing, despite, considering myself a member of this scientific community. I knew nothing about the fact that these atrocities were happening to dolphins on the other side of the planet. I'd spent several years trying to rescue and rehabilitate and release them and save these animals. And then to learn that this was happening, I didn't even know about it. I was shocked. I was really disappointed in myself primarily. So it was sort of the moment when I opened my eyes, and I realized that I was never going to be complacent in this by the fact that I was ignorant about it again. So I sort of made a transition and became active at that stage, and have really never turned back.
And I gather that's your dog reacting to your revelation.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That was my dog in the background.
That's all right.
Vying for a bit of attention.
It's just that when, someone will talk that way, that sensitively about animals, another animal is surely to respond. And your dog did right there. So
yeah, absolutely.
I understand. Also, from watching the video, I can tell that you are of mixed race. And did that have any bearing, or did that complicate things as you were trying to find your activist voice? You saw this movie. Your parents were really made sure that you were, they accommodated your animal concerns and the vet med track. But did the mixed race thing did it help or hinder, or how did that play into your activism?
Yeah. Not tremendously, although, I would say I feel fortunate in a lot of ways to be mixed race and to be surrounded by a lot of diversity. And also just growing up in Los Angeles, I was surrounded by diversity. It's a very big melting pot of a place. And so I really feel that having exposure to ethnic diversity in particular, it maybe helps instill a degree of compassion and sort of understanding, and a lot of issues that we deal with animals and in activism may appear to be sort of shrouded in this sort of ethnic issue or sort of characterized as an ethnic issue. And in reality, we're all human beings. And so I think that it actually allows me to relate to people, having sort of also myself being mixed race, but also having the life history that I've had and experience that I've had dealing with a variety of backgrounds of people and diverse ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. So I think that really ultimately we're all human beings. And so, and a lot of these issues that we deal with are just about being able to reach people and really relate to individuals in their heart and convey these messages. And that's, where I tried to come at with the PETA Reveals video as well. And I just try to be as real and as human as possible. And I think that that's the best way to influence hearts and minds and behavior.
So when you talk about mixed race, which ethnicities are you referring to now?
As primarily Filipino and Italian.
Filipino and Italian. Oh, well,
yeah.
Like we have, and my kids are Filipino and Irish.
I actually have Irish in me as well. I'm a big mutt.
All right. So, well, the what I was trying to get at is that when you become vegan or when some of your cultural things, conflict with, your activism, was that ever an issue?
I'm really fortunate. My family, we definitely have differing political opinions and differing opinions about a lot of things in life. But they overall fundamentally I have always been so deeply supported no matter what, in what I do, because I always, I act from from a very passionate place and they see that. So I'm fortunate that, I really haven't, at least from, my family, from that perspective, I really haven't dealt with a lot of challenges in that regard. However, I would say the challenge that I've probably dealt with the most is dealing with the veterinary community, the professional community that I'm a part of. And, there aren't a lot of us who work in advocacy at all, let alone in animal rights. So it is a bit of a challenging space. And I definitely face a bit of adversity there for the work that I do. But it's all worth it.
It's good to know the veterinarians are much tougher on you than the Filipinos and their pork lechon or anything like that. So that's good to know, and that you've dealt with that. And so now you've been with PETA how long now?
Been with PETA about 4.5 years.
Tell me about your role in dealing with companies in terms of the PETA Reveals video and the issue of Angora. Angora comes from rabbits. They produce this fur that create what kind of products, and how did you get involved in this? What kind of products come from the rabbits, the Angora rabbits?
The fur that is used from the Angora rabbit is very soft and sort of silky, and has a soft quality. And so it's used similar to the way that wool from sheep is used, and it's used primarily to make clothing. This particular company had, PETA Asia had conducted an investigation the previous year, the year before I went out to China, on the Angora industry. And it had lifted the veil on this product that nobody really knows what it is. And I think that's why it had such a powerful impact on the industry as a whole, because, Angora, nobody knows what Angora is. Is it synthetic? Is it from a plant or an animal, or nobody knows. So I think that in addition to the footage that was obtained of these rabbits being strapped down and the way that this fur is collected, just being ripped off of their bodies while they're alive, and it's horrifying, and you can hear their screams. The footage itself is horrifying. But then, it also was just so shocking to people to realize, all along I've been supporting, something this horrifying without even realizing it's a fiber that comes from an animal. So it really shook the industry, I think.
Well, I mean, but Angora, so it creates sweaters and jackets. It's primarily known for its warmth, right? I mean,
yes, yeah.
And so what is like the most common thing that would be made from Angora that people would say buy, and the next time they pick it up at a department store, they're going to have to think twice?
Primarily, you'll find it in sweaters, other garments. So you can find it in some blankets and things as well. So anytime you're buying a garment of any kind, everyone should be reading labels to make sure that they're not inadvertently supporting this industry. It's really declined a lot. I mean, we had, 330, I think over 330 retailers have stopped sourcing Angora after this investigation. So it's, fortunately, a lot of people are not selling it anymore, but it's still out there and is still prevalent. And people don't realize, when I go out and buy a sweater, that I might be supporting this type of animal suffering.
Yeah, and it's especially important now because this is the time when the weather is starting to change and people are looking for warmth. And, so they look at down, they look at wool, they look at merino wool, they look at this Angora thing, and they should really stop and think about it. So in your PETA Reveals talk, you go to China, and as I recall, the company wasn't sure that they were doing anything wrong. They said, oh, well, we have a supplier, and the suppliers are all right. So there's a lot of that kind of ignorance that goes on, right?
Yeah, that's a big thing that we struggle with. It's just convincing companies that, these investigations that we're doing, it's not a one-off occurrence. Like this is industry-wide. These are very common practices that we find. And so a lot of times when we show a company investigation footage, they might think, oh, well, not on my farm. But the reality is that it more than very likely is happening on the farm that you are supplying from. And so we were talking to them about it. They agreed. They had been told that rabbits on their farms aren't being plucked and that they're being raised humanely. And so, they took us up on an offer to escort them around those farms. And I was able to do that and actually to talk to them, to show them physically in person why these animals are suffering, how they're suffering. After that, fortunately, they agreed with us wholeheartedly, and they also stopped sourcing Angora completely.
All right, so let's go back just a bit. So the companies in New York or LA or someplace in the United States, and they're thinking, oh, well, we get our Angora supplies from these folks in China, and they tell us everything's fine. Everything's on the up and up. And you challenged them. And so you took them to the farms and describe what you saw. You showed the video on PETA Reveals, and hopefully after people hear our conversation, they will go to PETA Reveals and they'll see, exactly what you saw. But describe it for our listeners now. You have the company people in tow, visiting the farms, maybe for the first time, looking at how the rabbits are being treated. And what was it like? What did you see?
We visited a number of farms, and they were various sizes, some of them smaller, some of them massive, and these huge warehouses. And what we saw was really consistent across all of them. It was primarily a lot of disease. When you have animals in these highly overcrowded and highly unsanitary conditions, you're just going to have a lot of illness, and particularly infectious disease, which then, of course, they transmit to each other. And so you see, we went in there and we saw animals who were literally debilitated by infections of their eyes and their ears. It was incredibly hot inside a lot of these warehouses, not to mention the stench, but incredibly hot. So a lot of these rabbits who are temperature sensitive, rabbits are known for being very temperature sensitive animals, were just laying there, just huffing and puffing, just unable to really move. And so hot, just salivating nonstop. And so they would get these infections under their mouths because there was so much saliva that they were producing in the heat. And they would get these skin infections and eye infections. And a lot of those, especially the ear infections, are highly contagious. So we saw a lot of this. It was rampant. There's just not any control of the disease going on in these situations. Not to mention, none of these animals were able to be were euthanized. So the farmers, I think that they thought this is what we wanted to hear from them, but they were adamant that not a single animal was ever killed on this farm, and that included animals who were so near death that euthanasia was really the only humane option for these animals. And I begged these farmers to let me euthanize some of these animals, and the answer was always no. They just were adamant about it. So it was really sad.
You're a healer. When you see animals in need, animals in pain, animals suffering, animals who are unhealthy, you want to heal, but you couldn't, and you couldn't even ease their pain. How did it make you feel personally to see this?
Oh, it was horrible. It was a really hard experience personally. This was the first time I've ever really been in a situation like that. As a veterinarian, obviously, I'd spent years of my life training specifically to be able to intervene in suffering of this kind. And I was just physically unable to do absolutely anything to help them, and it was horrible. And I had to walk away from every one of those animals, hundreds of animals, over the course of these few days, touring these farms, who I was unable to help.
And what did it mean to the business people, the corporations, the companies who accompanied you on this trip, when they saw your reaction to the animals who were diseased and helpless and suffering? How were they reacting?
I think they were shocked because they really believed that these animals were being properly cared for. These people, their hearts were in the right place. They don't want to see animals suffering, let alone at their hands because of their company practices. So when they saw this, I think they were, they understood. Obviously they saw my reaction to it. They heard my explanation of what's wrong and why the animals are suffering, but they could also see it for their own eyes. And it was powerful. No one could deny, you almost didn't need me there explaining why these animals are suffering so much, because it's evident to anyone with a heart when you see an animal in that kind of pain and misery that is wrong. And so I think that they were definitely moved, and I think they were shocked, and I think that's a reflection of what they decided ultimately to do.
Yet at the same time, this is a rare occurrence. People are in New York in the garment industry making decisions, buying and jobbing and doing all that and selling these products, and they don't really think about, and unless they hear, it's out of sight, out of mind. They get assurances that things are okay, but it's rare that you'll have corporations accompanying someone like you from PETA to a farm, right? I mean, this doesn't happen all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very rare. So we give them a lot of credit for this, because we need more people to care this much about the products that they're sourcing, more companies to care. And of course, we get them to care by consumers caring and making their voices heard. So that's obviously why PETA runs the campaigns that we do. But yeah, absolutely. They get a lot of credit for taking this level of action.
You can't name the company, right? Is that
right.
Still the case? Okay, so you can't, and that's because of some kind of an agreement that PETA has with the company?
Yes.
And so, but they aren't using Angora. They're not sourcing from farms like this. They're not using it at all. But they have used or have turned to an alternative. And I gather this is one company out of how many? There's still dozens that still use Angora, that still use these suppliers, that still do this kind of cruelty, right? Or
yes.
They condone this kind of cruelty in their products.
Yes, absolutely. Like I said, we've had a lot of success. Tremendous success in just showing this horrifying video footage from the PETA Asia investigation has changed most of the companies we've spoken to over the years, has changed their minds. But we're still actively working on discussions with companies who are still sourcing Angora. It is still a very big problem.
And while this one particular company doesn't use this supplier, the supplier hasn't shut down. They're probably continuing to sell it to the bad companies, right?
Yes. We have every reason to believe that they are. I don't know personally whether or not, how much the suppliers themselves have been impacted by this. Obviously, the farms are open and operating. And so we would certainly assume that Angora is going to other companies who are still purchasing that product and who are still selling it to unknowing consumers in most cases.
I mean, the fact is that they haven't shut down. They haven't stopped. They're still getting rabbits. They're still skinning them, selling their fur. And so it really is a matter of going after all the companies. And you probably have just scratched the surface in terms of trying to convince companies to change, right?
Yeah. In fact, for anyone who's listening, you can go online and you can find action alerts to sign that we currently have active on several companies that, we're trying to get them to change their practices. So yeah, we're still very active on that front.
One of the things about your PETA Reveals talk is that it came across, it was very touching. It had great video, and none of this was undercover video. They just allowed the supplier and the corporations allowed you to take video, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so it's all out in the open. It's all right under our noses, and only having a moral conscience and say, no, we can't do that. And so one company did, but others continue. And so one thing that got me about your PETA Reveals is that you didn't want it to be a total downer. There was something positive that came out of this and something empowering. And that is that consumers, when they see this video, they can do something and they can realize the power that they have. And it's not insignificant, this power they have. I mean, if people said, I don't want to buy Angora because of what Angora represents, you could not just shut down the companies that sell Angora, but you can shut down the suppliers as well, right?
Yeah. Consumer power is absolutely everything. When it comes to changing business practices, companies listen to their customers. We are their constituents. We are the ones supporting or not supporting. Every single time we put $1 down on the table for anything, you are essentially casting a vote that you want more of that in the future. And so, that power is, it's tremendous. People really highly underestimate it. So yeah, that was the big message that I wanted everyone to get out of that talk, is that you don't have to go to China. You don't have to escort companies around Angora rabbit fur farms to make a difference here. You really just have to pay attention to what you're purchasing and make conscious decisions. And that is the best way for the average person to change the world every day.
And it really is a supply and demand issue. I mean, they wouldn't go to Angora rabbits and use them for clothing if there wasn't a demand for it. But there is a demand for the silky feel of the Angora fur. And it's not just fur, but they weave it into a fabric, into a sweater. And it's the warmth, it's the luster, and it's all that, and it's fashionable. And I mean, can you look at a fashionable Angora sweater and not be reminded of the pain you saw in China?
Those images will be seared in my mind forever. I think, honestly, if people knew how just incredible the vegan the technology is these days to create synthetic vegan fibers and synthetic furs, synthetic leather. It's everything, every one of those things that you already mentioned and more. I mean, we have the ability to just synthesize all of this. We don't need animals to be fashionable or to be warm. It's just a different day and age now. So it's time to move beyond it. And I think once people realize that, I can do this without harming animals, then that's a life changer, for everyone, animals included. It's a world changer. And I think we're seeing that now, more companies really embracing vegan synthetic alternatives to animals.
You did all this work. You took the company to China. You saw and you showed them what happens with their supplier. And yet this is, like I said, a moment ago, this is just one company. So in some ways to triumph, you got this one company that can't be named to change. But it's still such an incredible uphill fight to change other companies. So I guess my question is, what keeps you motivated to continue the fight? What keeps you motivated to not give up?
Really, it's being able to be a tangible part, to play a tangible role in so many tremendous victories, and not to discredit or discount them just because it's one company. I really feel grateful that every single day I get to do the work that I get to do and to make a tangible difference in animal lives. And we see, every week we have victories in, various departments, not just on the, fashion and furs and skins front, but on every front where humans are just abusing animals in tremendously awful ways. And we're making a real difference. And I think that for me, that's where I get my motivation, is being able to be a part of it. Every single one of these no matter how little they are, every single one of these victories is making a difference in the world. And I know that if we just continue pushing forward, that we will see phenomenal change. We will change the world for the better.
Well, Heather Rowley, I appreciate you being here on the PETA Podcast. I hope people have listened to your words here on the podcast and will be compelled to go to PETA.org and see your video and hear your story and see you tell your story, because it's accompanied by these very graphic images that I think make the case that Angora is a cruel fabric, and if you're a consumer, you should be just saying no to Angora, especially if you know what happens to the rabbits who give up their fur for the materials. Yeah. So Heather Rowley, PETA veterinarian, thank you very much for being on the PETA Podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Heather Rowley, a veterinarian with PETA, talking about her trip to China with those fashion execs who, after seeing the cruelty to rabbits, changed their policy on Angora. They stopped using Angora to make their products. See what Heather showed them on her PETA Reveals talk. It's a special video on PETA.org. See the video and take action. Contact clothing companies about Angora. And don't forget your power as an individual consumer. When the weather gets colder, remember, you always have a choice. The animals don't. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. Find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on amok.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.